Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program. I am Jessie Wheeler. I am the genealogy specialist here at the Boston Public Library. Before we get started, just a few notes. The chat function is disabled, so you will not be able to use that. If you have any questions, we will have plenty of time once the presentation is over. You are more than welcome to use the Q&A box. I'm now there's a link to the handout in the chat. In case you didn't get that in the reminder email. This program is being recorded, and I will be sending a link to everyone who is registered as soon as the link is ready. Okay, let's see. So as I said, the link to the handout is in here. Let me just make sure that's working. Yeah, so you just need to click on the link in the chat and it'll come up right here. So let's see, and over on the upper right here, there's a down arrow over a little line. That's what you click on in order to download it. You can't download it directly from the link if you're using the chat. So that's how you access the handout in case anyone else is having trouble. Okay, so before we get started, let's see, all right. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people and as a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, free to all. Okay, so let's see. So once again, I'm going to pop a link to the handout in here. Okay, so this is researching female ancestors. That's the topic of the program tonight. As I said, we will have plenty of time for a Q&A afterward. So please, so if you have a question regarding the content of this presentation or anything else related to genealogy services at the Boston Public Library, you will have plenty of time for that at the end. So as I said before, my name is Jessie Wheeler. I'm the genealogy specialist here at the Boston Public Library. I work in the Research Services Department at the Central Library in Copley Square. And I've been doing this job for a few years now, so I think I got a good handle on it. All right, so what specifically are we covering today? We're going to go through a few basic research tips, actually a lot of research tips if you're researching female ancestors, and this will apply in general, not just to what we might have in Boston. We're going to go over a few different useful records that you may not have thought of in doing genealogy research for your female ancestors. We're going to talk about some archives outside of the BPL that have related material that will be useful in this research. We're also going to go over a few useful websites for this kind of research, and we will talk about a few resources available at the BPL for those of you who live in the area or are planning to come here sometime soon. We're going to talk about some books. We're going to look at a few research guides produced by the BPL, and we're going to look at a few of our databases. So just a few research tips. Also a note on the images, these are all in Digital Commonwealth. These are posters advertising magazines. So this previous one was from Harper's Weekly, and this one is from Ladies Home Journal. You can see. Okay, and this is also a good tip here for just in general genealogy research, but this is especially important if you're researching women and if you're having trouble. You always want to ask anyone who's still living who might remember or who knew the person that you're researching. So someone who knew her, such as a relative, a friend, a neighbor, someone who worked with her, just someone who knew her well, might know more about her, can give you some help. Someone or you might want to talk to someone that you might know has a collection of records or other information about the family. So if maybe this person has a distant relative or someone else who wound up with a collection of materials from the family, they might be able to help you out with that. The other thing one other thing that's also very important, when you are researching, again, this is good in general, but this is especially true for women, you really want to pay attention to the details in a record aside from the person's name. So this is especially true if you're looking for someone and you don't know exactly what their name is, or their name is written wrong. There's a lot of mistakes in records. Things are spelled wrong. They might have gone by a different name that you didn't know, or they might be in there by a nickname, and they might be in there by a married name or maiden name. This is really difficult with women because there are name changes, generally speaking, in the past. So if you're looking at a record and if the other information is correct, aside from the names, such as the birth date and birthplace, an address, their spouse's name, again, even if the name is slightly wrong, it still might be the right record. So don't discount a record right away if the name isn't exactly what you thought it's supposed to be. As I said, people make mistakes all the time in either writing these records out or transcribing them. Related to names, you want to search for every possible name variation. This gets more complicated when you're researching women. They could be listed under a maiden name, a married name, a nickname, their initials. They could be in there under their husband's name. It's Mrs. John Smith. That was very traditional for a long time. Or their name might be misspelled. As I said, people make mistakes. If she was ever married, or if you think she was married, best thing to do just to broaden your search is to search for her under her married and maiden names if you know them. So if you do know them, try both. There could be records related to her life from before and after she was married. And again, further complicating it, if she was married multiple times, try all of her married names. I have some personal experience researching someone for a person, and this woman was married 4 times. It was really, really hard to track her down because she was married so many times. She also variously went by a middle name and her confirmation name. So she was really hard to track down, but you keep in mind, search for every possible name. Confirmation name is something that wasn't on the list, but that's another thing. If the person was Catholic and they were confirmed, try their confirmation name. That can sometimes pop up in records. And this is especially important for women. Look for her husband or anyone else she might have been living with. So aside from a husband, she could have been living with another relative. It was not uncommon, especially for widows or older unmarried women, to be living with a relative, most commonly a sibling. There's a lot of people in census records who are listed as a sister-in-law or sister of a head of household. They could have been living with an aunt or uncle. They could have been living with an adult child. This is really common for widows. Could have been living with a cousin, an in-law, so on and so forth. So if you have an idea of who she might have lived with if she wasn't living with her husband or on her own, try searching for those folks. And again, this is a sad commentary on how records were done for a very long time. Try looking for her, especially her male associates. Again, particularly husbands, fathers, brothers. Or she might have been listed as a witness or another participant in a record that involved perhaps her neighbors. There's some court cases or probate cases where she might have been a witness, or she might have been a party to a lawsuit, or some other thing with her neighbors, friends, godparents, or godchildren, or really anyone else. So court records can be a really good resource for this if you stumble upon some information like this, or if you happen to know that they were involved with a court case. And you're also going to need to look at a lot of different types of records. There's a lot more than you would think of, really a lot more. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide. The next section, rather, I'm sorry. All right, so now we're going to talk about useful records. There are a lot of different kinds of records beyond the usual census records, city directories, and things like that you're going to want to try to take a look at. One thing, there are published local histories. So the BPL has a pretty large collection of these covering primarily Massachusetts. These are histories of cities and towns, sometimes counties, or sometimes there will be histories of entire states. Why these are useful? This is good. Generally, these sorts of histories will cover from the founding of the place to whenever the book was published. Oftentimes in these books, they will have the information about founding families or prominent property owners, people who are prominent in the town, business people and their families. So there could be some information about someone there. If you know where someone lives, you could try researching the area to see if they're mentioned. So the books like this could have information about a woman's maiden name, her parents, her birthplace, or even her descendants if you're going back far enough. As I said, we have a significant collection of local histories in our online catalog. And we're going to just take a quick look at that. That will load for me. All right, so this is our online catalog. So just for the heck of it, let's see. We're going to go to subject. And let's do Quincy history. All right, so that's probably wasn't the best example because of Quincy Market, but what the heck. So let's see. So you can see here, we have a lot of books about Quincy. And so this one here, legendary locals. So if you had an ancestor who happened to have been a legendary local of Quincy, this might have some information about them. Right, and in general, if you are looking for a specific town or place, if you're looking in our catalog, just type in the name of the place and the word history, and hopefully we'll have something good for you that'll come up. Right, so another set of records that might be useful. So there are city directories, with the caveat that women for the Boston area and generally for the rest of the country are not going to be listed in the 19th century and into the first few decades of the 20th century. They will not be listed unless they were heads of household, which generally meant they were widowed. Now, there are some exceptions to this. There were a few professional women that would be listed on their own, even if they were married. There is a female doctor who worked in Boston in the late 19th century who is listed on her own, but that is pretty rare. Women will eventually be listed, but only with their husbands. So that is why you need to know their husband's name. They will be listed, their first name will be listed in parentheses with their husband's name. Eventually, women will be listed under their own right, regardless of marriage. They'll be listed on their own. They'll have their own entries, but that's later on in the 20th century. If you're looking 19th century, that's not going to be the case. There's also lists of residents. Again, big caveat there. These are drawn from voter registration rolls. So there will be no women listed until 1921. And even after that, if they weren't registered to vote, they're not going to be in here. So that is something to keep in mind. There are also professional and trade directories. So these are basically going to be publications specific to various industries or just specific place, the businesses in a place. If a woman was a professional, for instance, if she was a doctor or if she was in a trade. There's an example of a woman I was researching recently who owned a fairly well-regarded clothing store in Boston. She was a seamstress and she was very well-regarded. So she had listings in professional directories for the clothing and for the garment industry. So that's something, if you're researching someone who did have a job like that, that would be listed in a directory, those are things you can try. And also society directories. So society directories, these are things like the Social Register and more locally, the Clark's Boston Blue Book. So these are really just for rich people. The middle class and lower middle class and lower classes will not be in there. These are just going to be rich, local, prominent citizens, not even necessarily all rich folks, just for as an example. The Fitzgerald family, who were ancestors of President Kennedy, they were not listed in the social registers, but the fact that they were quite wealthy, most likely because they were Irish Catholics. So this is going to be very heavily focused on what we would consider for locally Boston Brahmins, or just in general, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So that's the social register. The Fitzgeralds, however, are listed in the Blue Book. They were a little bit more inclusive in that regard, but that is very heavily focused early on Back Bay and really just the rich, quote, the rich neighborhoods, the neighborhoods where a lot of the wealthy lived and all the trendy places to live. So directories like this are useful because they could, in some cases, if you're looking at a professional or a trade directory, they could have information about a woman's education. So if she did go to a college or something, you can find out more information about her there. Would have her occupation, it could have her birthplace, any professional awards she might have won, and any club memberships. These are going to be listed in the society directories. One thing that they did include was what clubs they belonged to. So there were women's clubs back then. They were mostly focused towards charity, but if any of them were members of them, that would be noted in the society directories. Yep. Okay. Another big group are institutional records. So what this means, these are basically things like hospitals, so also insane asylums, settlement houses, which would basically be houses for poor people. The goal of them was often to give them an education towards gaining work skills so they could get a job. So there's things like, probably most famous is something like in Chicago, Hull House, founded by Jane Addams. That's a settlement house. And also at the during the time period, particularly in the 19th century, when tuberculosis was somewhat endemic, a lot of people got it and there wasn't good treatment for it, there would be tuberculosis sanitariums. So and there's also, sadly, things like the eugenics record office. So eugenics was, sadly, it's a very sad chapter in world history. It was accepted, it was considered perfectly fine, and there was a eugenics record office. So if you want to read more about that, you can, there's a link to this in your handout if you want to read more about that in here. Basically what it was, they wanted to look at people and sterilize people who they thought didn't deserve to have children, to try to, quote unquote, purify the human race. So as I said, because this was, widely accepted at the time, there would be records for that, unfortunately. So records like this are useful because they could have information about a woman's marital status, her maiden name, how many children she had, and in some cases their names, this will be especially true in settlement house records because their children might have been with her there. Could have information about her birthplace and birth date. Could have, if you're looking at hospital records or sanitarium records, it would have information about her, where she died and when she died. Medical records will have her medical history, obviously. They might have information about her education, her occupation. Records like this, these are probably also going to be the only records that would have a physical description of them. And perhaps later on, there might be a photograph and also religious affiliation. So these types of records can have a lot of really good information that can be hard to find any other way if you're researching your female ancestors. Okay, so those are institutional records. Another big group, and I like to try to promote this in all of my classes, and this is true for all genealogy. Newspapers. They are more than just obituaries. There are all sorts of useful things that could be in newspapers relating to women. Depending on what time period you're looking at and what location, there will be notices repudiating wives' debts, which means, let's say, and this is more common in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Let's say a husband was basically sick of his wife. If they were separated, he would publish an announcement in the newspaper, "We're separated. I am not responsible for her debt anymore," if she had any debt. So this is basically a way to say, hey, we're not we're not really living together anymore. I'm not responsible for her. So it would generally have their names, what kind of debts they were. I've actually seen a few notices of these. They can be somewhat entertaining. It's really interesting to see what kinds of things were in the newspaper, particularly in the colonial era. This was really common in the colonial era. Other things that used to be published, especially during the times when not everyone had a mailing address, and in areas, perhaps more rural areas, where you would just, your name would just be, your mail would just be your name and the town where you lived, and you would go to your local post office to pick up your mail every so often. So there's unclaimed mail notices. So that would say, oh, this person lived in this area at one time, so you could get an idea of where they were. And there are also women's sections. So these are less common today, but for a while there would be sections. There would be articles about fashion, love advice, various things like that, cooking, things that were considered stereotypically women's issues, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. A lot of these sections were also written by women. So if you happen to have an ancestor who wrote something like this, you might have a good idea of what she was up to. So, and this is just a small sampling of the sorts of things that you can find in newspapers. I highly recommend newspapers for genealogy research in general. There's a lot you can find. So we've gone over a little about this, but a lot of these things that you can find in newspapers, this could have her maiden name, particularly if you managed to find out something like a wedding announcement. Could have their husband's name, especially if you're looking at the repudiating of the debt and various other things. It would have their marital status. It could have their address. And if you're researching someone who is of a higher social standing, you might find out about their social life. A lot of newspapers, particularly bigger ones, would have, in the Boston Globe, they called it the table talk section, which was basically a fancy term for a gossip column. So it would have society doings, like such and such went to such and such's house for a visit. These people went to this person's party on this day. This person traveled from here to here. So and so just arrived on this ship. So this can be useful if you're researching richer or more prominent people to figure out what they were doing with their lives, because society has always been fascinated by the rich, wealthy, and by the prominent. So looking at society columns is a great way to find information about what these folks were doing. We did mention briefly women's groups. There were several women's groups. These are just a few that you could find information about. First one is called the Daughters of Rebecca. So this is the auxiliary group to the Independent Order of Oddfellows, which is a fraternal organization. The Rebeccas were, as I said, the female auxiliary. So these were, so there you can see they are still around. So the members have to be 16 to 18 years or older, believe in a supreme being, and faithful to their country. So they've been around for a very long time. You can see here, if you click on history, the Oddfellows themselves have been around since the 1700s. I believe the Rebeccas were founded later on, but again, they're still around. So if you have a relative who is in the Rebeccas, there might be some record of her membership somewhere. So that's something that you can look for. Another big one, especially if you're researching African American female ancestors, is the National Association of Colored Women's Club. This group is, let's see, so they are the result of a merger of several different groups in the country. It started in the 19th century, so you can read more about these. There's a lot, they have a lot of different chapters all over the country. So if you have an ancestor who is in one of these groups or in the big merge group, you can try looking at them. Oh, whoops. Sorry, just one second. See if we can get back there. All right, sorry about that. All right, continuing. And then there's the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which if you know your history here, this was a group that agitated for temperance, or basically they were against alcohol. They were founded in 1874. They were a very, very popular group. A lot of women in this. One of the more prominent members here is there's Annie Whitmire. Carrie Nation was involved in this movement. I'm not sure if she was in this group exactly, but they're around for a while. They actually are still around, oddly enough, even though prohibition ended. They still don't like alcohol. It is a very much a religious-based organization, and they do still exist. So if you had an ancestor who was in here, you can try contacting them to see what they might have. I found it very fascinating when I was doing research for this that they still existed. It's not something I knew before. I was kind of surprised. Oops, go back. And we also have the Young Women's Christian Association, which is related to, which is actually not affiliated with the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA. As I said, it is a Christian organization. You'll find a lot of these societies are religious in nature. They were either started at churches or founded by very religious people. And obviously the Young Christian Association is based in religion and just in general Christianity. And again, like a lot of these, they are still around. So if you had a relative in there, you can try them. So why these can be useful, they can contain information about a person's name. So if you have a vague idea that you knew of someone who was in one of these groups, you can try looking at a list and see if you can find their name. If they were very heavily involved, you could see if they had a rank. So if they were the head of a chapter, if they were a secretary or something, you might be able to find that information. You might be able to find their dates of membership, if they participated in meetings, and if you're really, really lucky and you happen to get a really good record collection, there might be some photographs. Some groups would have annual meetings, and there do exist some photographs of these meetings. If they had a publication that had pictures of their members, you might find it there. So as I said, all of these things that we listed, they are still around. So you would need to contact them. If you know what chapter the person was in, you would actually want to try contacting them if they're still around. If you're researching an institution, a group that doesn't exist anymore, you'd want to try, there's a chance that their records are held by another group in the area. I can't guarantee that they'll be there, but that's something definitely to look at. There are a few random things that wound up at college archives. We're going to look at some of those later. There are things that wound up in random places. So if you happen to, if you're still looking for these, contact some group in the area where it was located to see if they might have the records. So we just talked about archives. So we're now gonna take a look at some archives and websites. So here's another one from Ladies Home Journal. Just thought it was a really cool picture. Okay, so we talked about this briefly. There is the American Philosophical Society Library has records from the Eugenics Record Office. Now it's a little redundant. So you can see here's their finding aid. It was founded in, it's founded in 1910 in New York. You can look down here. This will give you some information about the office, what their collections have. So they have records going back actually from 1670 to 1964. So they have a lot of interesting stuff in here. So again, this is held by the American Philosophical Society. So you would need to contact them if you want to try looking at anything that in this collection. And there's actually more records. There at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory actually has an image archive of the American eugenics movement. So this website is a little funky, I will admit. They have thousands of items. They have a few different virtual exhibits that you can look at if you're just kind of looking to see what they have. So you can find out more information about what it was here and the effects of it on other aspects of life, including immigration and marriage laws, things like that. So let's take a, oh, it has a pop-up. Okay, so yeah, it is pop-up, so that is something you want to look at. Like I said, the website's a little funky. Okay, so we were just looking at the Order of Oddfellows, Daughters of Rebecca. So they have their own genealogy research section. So this is something that some of these groups are aware of, that folks might be contacting them. So they lay out all the steps you should take if you're researching an ancestor who's either in an Oddfellow or Rebecca. They give you a lot of good information about how to proceed with researching with their records. So that's something you definitely want to check out if that's the collection you want to use. So we were talking before about records that might not be held by the groups anymore, but by a different place. So Smith College has some young women's Christian Association records. So their coverage goes from 1875 to 1975. So again, if you're looking for that time period, and if you look through here, like I said, they have a very detailed finding aid. If you look through here and there's something you want to look at, you would want to contact Smith College. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm just getting over a cold here, so my throat's a little scratchy. So let's see. So, and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, there's a bunch of different institutions that have records for them. If you would just take a look at World Cat, and you can see here, do accept cookies. So Harvard has some. I don't recommend going to Harvard. They can be a little stingy. Generally, most other colleges will be a little more easygoing than Harvard, but UMass Amherst is another place. So this is a microfilm set. So sometimes you will encounter this. A group just decided to microfilm a set of records, so a lot more places will have access to it. So this is the case for the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and this covers from 1895 to 1992. So that's going to be a little bit more accessible than some of these other record sets we're talking about, because that's at a few different libraries. There we go. All right, so moving on to a few websites. So I've just basically scratched the surface of what you can do to research your female ancestors. It is not a straightforward search. It can be very difficult, especially if you're not sure of some information. So I've compiled a list here of other sources you can go to, articles you can read to get more information and more tips, because there's far more than I can cover here in the limited time we have. So we have here, there's two articles here from Amy Johnson Crow. Amy Johnson Crow is a professional genealogist who has a very well-regarded blog and podcast. So I've linked to two articles for her here. So in this one, it's 3 practical strategies for finding female ancestors. So this is also an episode of her podcast. It's only 12 minutes long, and you can listen to it right in the browser. You can just, it covers a lot of what I've talked about here. One thing she had that I didn't go over is research all for children. So that goes on to looking at her associates, look for her children. If you know the names of her children, try looking for them. Then she also goes into more unusual sources for finding female ancestors. So she goes over some more records that we don't have time to look at here. Again, this is just a 12-minute podcast. She has very short podcasts that you can listen to in your browser. So it's very easy to look at this stuff. So, and there's also an article from Familysearchorg, which I very highly recommend using this site. It is a huge site. It is free. It's entirely free. You do have to create a guest account to use it. I'm sorry, you have to register for an account to use it, but it is entirely free, and they have a ton of stuff. And they also have a lot of they have their own blog with guidance on various topics and more strategies to look at this. You'll see a lot of this is going to come up. Looking for the men in their life. That's a big one. And they talk here about headstones. Like I said, there's a lot of different search strategies you can go for that I don't have time to cover here. Okay, and there's also Middle State Tennessee University, the Walker Library has a database, a free database that you can look at. It's Discovering American Women's History Online. This is specifically for American women. So we're just going to click on Browse here. So you can look at their different collections. They have collections of photographs. They have ephemera like pamphlets, programs, trade cards, various photographs. They have a ton of really great stuff relating to women's history in the United States. And of course, there's Cindy's List, which, as I like to say, is the Wikipedia for genealogy. It is run by a single person. Cindy is delightful, but she is just one person. So sometimes you might stumble on a broken link or a dead link here. So just, keep in mind, she usually will update it pretty well if you let her know it's broken. Okay, and this is just an article from the National Archives Prologue magazine. This will go into women in naturalization, which, to go over briefly, that can also really affect women's status. So there was a time period where married women would automatically gain citizenship if their husbands got it. So for a certain time period, forget exactly what the dates were, up until, sometime, I will have to look that up, but for a certain time period, a married woman would automatically get citizenship when her husband got it. So for that time period, there will not be any naturalization records for her. It can be really tricky. Naturalization immigration is kind of tricky topic, so we'll just go over this briefly. Let me pull this up here. Naturalization, okay. Okay, so from 1855 to 1922, married immigrant women automatically became citizens. So from 1855 to 1922, married women, if their husbands became citizens, they're not going to have their own records. You need to look for their husband's record. Once again, you got to look for the husband. This is going to come up a lot in here. So it's just very briefly, that's the biggest thing that will affect naturalization records. It was also true for a certain period of time. If an American woman married a foreign citizen, she would lose her American citizenship. This is most widely known as a practice for what were called the dollar princesses. So there was a period of time in the late 19th, early 20th century where a lot of American heiresses were marrying nobles, mostly from England, and so they would automatically become British citizens, and they wouldn't automatically become citizens, they would lose their American citizenship permanently. That was it. There are some cases where women were able to get their citizenship back after a husband died or they were divorced, but it was really, really hard to do. All right, so we're going to go over briefly some resources at the BPL that we have that I've mentioned a little bit here. So here's just a few books. Some of these are a little older. There aren't a ton of books about this, sadly. So I'm keeping an eye out for any new books that we might get that cover this. So we're not going to look at all of these, but these are just generally going to be some basic guides to how to do this kind of research. And there's two subject-specific ones from the Revolutionary era, the colonial era. If they'll have colonial American doctresses, which I just thought was a fascinating topic. So these are going to be stories about American women who are doctors who practice medicine in the colonial era. They might have called themselves, they might be considered doctors now, maybe, but it was a little bit of a gray area. A lot of them might have just been called midwives or healers or something like that. So that's something that you're interested in, definitely take a look at that. And there's also bibliography of women during the Revolution. So that's done by the Society of Daughters of the Revolutionary, the American Revolution, so the DAR. So that'll give you some information, just some basic information about folks like that. So we're not going to look at all of these. I included these links so you can look at them at your leisure later on. There are links to all of these in your handout, so you don't need to worry about writing this all down. These are just links to a few of the research guides produced by BPL staff that would have information about record collections and other things you can look at that might have information about women. We've already talked about the list of residents. And there's also things like a guide to tax records. You can find more information about the directories we have, newspapers, the trade catalogs, and a bunch of different things. These are all produced by staff. We try to keep them up to date, and a lot of them they're just really good resources. I highly recommend this section for really any kind of research you're doing. We have a lot of information. Okay. And these are just a few of the databases you can use. A lot of these are going to be newspapers. So I talked a lot about the newspapers. I really wish I really would like more people to use them. They're very, very useful. So these are some of the databases we have that you can look for newspapers. There's 19th century US newspapers, various other things. If you're looking for an archive, a collection that might have something you're looking for, you can go to FrenchCanadian. This is a really great website. You can even just search for a person. So let's just, for the heck of it, try looking for Carrie Nation. And it'll come up with collections all over the country that have, will come up with libraries, colleges, various things that have anything to do with her. So you can see here, Arkansas State Archives has a collection of letters from her to Mr. Stevens. So you can find a lot of random stuff using FrenchCanadian. That's another little used site that I am trying to promote. So and the rest of these, and then there's also archives of sexuality and gender you can try looking at. This is more of a historical bent, and it's really useful if you're just looking generally about women's history or if you're researching a prominent woman. So this is this is a Gale database. So there's a lot of cool stuff in here, and they have, this is basically actually a collection of 3 different sites, sex and sexuality and LGBTQ history and culture. All right, so now we will start the Q&A period. I'm going to start with the questions that are in there already. If you have a question, please feel free to pop it in the Q&A. If you have a question about the content of this presentation or a question about genealogy resources at the BPL or genealogy in general, please feel free to type it in. All right, let's see. All right, so I'm just gonna pop a link to the handout in there again for anyone who missed it before. So that's gonna go into the chat. There we go. All right, Joyce is asking how to handle cultural differences between a husband and wife's names, but the US will consider them different names and therefore different families, e.g. Papadopoulos for the man and Papadopoulos for the woman. So that's something, like I was saying before, you're gonna just try searching for both, because again, it could vary from record to record. In the United States, they might put them both under Papadopoulos, or they might keep them separated. So really, it's a lot of work, but this generally is a lot of work doing genealogy research. Just search for both and search for all the possible variations for both, because the US records unfortunately don't really account for things like that. They usually try to make it conform to US naming conventions, particularly in the 19th century. So just search for both. Okay, thank you, Marcia. Marcia has a tip here, which is a good one. Look for vital records of any on all children. So that's, again, looking for the children. So vital records, things like birth records, marriage records, death records, a lot of them, this isn't necessarily guaranteed, but a lot of those records will have a space for the parents' names and parents' birthplaces. Again, it's not a guarantee, but that information should be there. All right, and so someone's asking, would homes for unwed mothers from a long time ago have records in the same place? So that depends. So you would really, like I say, you'd want to maybe try just generally Googling the name of the place to see. Sometimes archival collections will turn up on Google searches, or try FrenchCanadian for the name of the place. If you know the name of the place, then you can just try searching for that. See if there's a record collection for it somewhere, and then try contacting the repository to see what they have. So why I say it depends is those records may not exist anymore. There's a lot of institutions like things like orphanages or homes for unwed mothers, things like that, where the records just might not exist anymore. They either were destroyed or lost. So again, unfortunately, it really depends, but definitely that's something you can try looking for. If they exist and someone has them, that's definitely something you can try, but I can't guarantee that anything will be available. That's also, again, dependent on if you know what it was called. If you don't know what it's called, that's a little harder. Unless you're talking about maybe a smaller place that only had like one or two of those places, you might be able to figure it out. But if you're talking about some place like Boston, New York City, Chicago, there have been a lot of places like that. So it might be a little hard to track down. So Melora was asking, what was a settlement house? So I believe I covered that before, but just to go over it again, it was basically a charitable institution for the poorer classes. That was a lot of these are run by women. It was a charitable endeavor. They would have classes focused on primarily on developing work skills, but there would also be basic classes like teaching someone how to read. And again, a lot of these were geared towards women becoming more independent for being able to get a job and to support themselves and their children. So this was used a lot by immigrant women, these sorts of things, because they generally would need more help getting started wherever they were. So that's what a settlement house was. Okay, Anne is asking, when researching newspapers, what type of search terms would you use? Anything besides the woman's name? Also, what do you recommend when you find something of interest in the newspaper? What do you recommend saving? Citation, the article, the page. So search terms, try the woman's name first. That's generally what you want to start with, and try her husband's name. Again, it's going more broadly in what we discussed. Search for anyone that might have been associated with her, or if you're looking for a specific type of thing, try looking for her name, a variant of her name, and the thing. So marriage, if you're looking for a marriage or something else, but generally you want to start with a name. You don't want to put too much in, or you won't get anything. That's basically, and that's true for just all kind of research in general. You want to start broadly and then kind of narrow it down as you go. So always just start with the name and see what you can find, and then you could try adding more search terms if you're finding a lot of results based on, and figure out what something specific that you want to find. Okay, so Penelope is asking, do you have suggestions for finding records for nurses and teachers in 1870s on? So again, that depends. Teachers might be a little bit easier. For instance, I know the Boston Public Schools published a manual that would list all the teachers and all the employees of the schools. So it would tell you where the teacher worked and what their title was and everything like that. So teachers are a little bit easier to deal with. Again, that depends on where you're looking at. I'm not sure if all places would have something like that, and that is public schools. Private schools, parochial schools are going to be a little different. If the schools are still in existence, and this is true even if you're looking for students, if the school is still around, try contacting the school to see what they might have. If they don't have anything, they could at least tell you who does. Like I know like I said, the BPL has a lot of stuff for the Boston Public Schools. Nurses, that's a little trickier. I'm not sure if there's going to be records for things like that. But again, if you know the hospital that they were at, you can try finding a repository for the records to see if they might have that, or the hospital's still around, try that. Or if you know what nursing school they went to, and if they're still around, you could try that, or again, look for a repository for them. So nurses are a little bit trickier. So, and that really depends on where they worked. If they were a home care nurse, a private nurse, it might be hard to find any kind of records on them. Okay, let's see. Oh, I'm sorry if anyone else was having trouble with the volume. You might need to check your device's settings. I just have this on medium volume. Okay, so Mark is asking, any hints on records for Canada for 1850 through 1890? So, oh wow. Okay, so I'm gonna say briefly, we don't have a lot of records at the BPL for Canada. I know there is a lot in ancestry.com. There's quite a bit there that they have for Canada. They have some census records and some other records. But what I will suggest that Mark do is send an email to ask@bpl.org. I put that in the chat there. So I would ask Mark to send his question into there so we can take a look at it and get back to you, because this is a bit more than we can get to here. But I will say there are records in existence for Canada. There's a little bit more than I can go into here, but definitely please submit your question and I will write back to you. Okay, let's see. Dina's asking, is there an easy way to research Jewish women who aren't practicing Judaism? So you really would just be researching like you'd research any other woman. It doesn't really matter if they were a non-practicing Jewish person. You just, follow the stuff I've said here. You're just basically researching a woman. Conversely, for those who are researching women who were active in their faith, you could contact any temples or synagogues they were involved with, any societies they might have been involved with. But if they weren't practicing, it's just you'd research them like you would research any other woman, and just kind of still go through the steps we've looked at, and then you'll look at guidance there. Do that. Okay, so let's see. So Sue is asking for sources for finding church records. So see, I am going to send you a link. We do have a section on looking for church records. So I'm going to pop that into the chat here for you. So we do have some information on that. Okay, there we go. So we'll try that. Okay, let's see. Allison's asking about records regarding woman who is a full-blooded French Canadian First Nation and her ancestors. So that is, again, so you're going to need to probably go to some Canada records. We do have some stuff here. We do have another section here for French Canadian, not specifically First Nations in Canada. Let me see if we can. Oh, there we go. Okay, so it's under the French section. We do have a section here on the French, researching French Canadian. So there are several different, I'm just gonna, again, I'll pop this over in the chat box for you, so you can take a look at that. There are some resources available here I just have them for French Canadian. I have not found anything specifically for First Nation French Canadian, but that's definitely something you can take a look at from what I've given you here, or again, just send us an email to ask@bpl.org so we can get back to you on that. All right, and Jathan is asking, does the BPL have maps or information on Boston around 1635? So we do. So more specifically, the Map Center does. So the easiest way to get to that is in Digital Commonwealth. Let's do, you can search for Boston map. I think it was 1634. And of course, yeah, the search function is not the best. Here we go, maps. Okay, so this is really the only map I think that's in existence that covers Boston from that time period. The closest we can get is 1634. So again, I will pop in a link for you there. So we do have this. There are some other things that we might have. I don't know off the top of my head. It depends really on what kind of information you're looking for. If you're looking for property ownership or business licenses or something like that. So again, if you take a look at this stuff here and you need more help, just again, send us an email to ask@bpl.org. Okay, so Neri is asking, my heritage is Puerto Rican, most of us have Taino Indian blood, Spanish, African, Italian. Do you know of any free place to go search our family line? So that's a lot. So again, I'm going to point you to our research, back to our research guide. So I do have a section for Italian research here, so you can definitely take a look at that. I don't know about Spanish specifically. sorry, let's see, I do have a section for African American. I'm not sure how far back your heritage is, so that really depends. And I don't know about free, but the best free site I would try is Familysearch.org. You do, again, like I said before, you do need to have an account, but it is free, and they have a lot of really great guides that you can look at. So that's the best free place I know that you can do any kind of genealogy research. I don't know if they're going to have specifically Taino research, but they do have sections for Spanish, African, Italian, and Puerto Rican that you can look at. So definitely, I would try first Familysearch.org. Okay, so Katrina's asking, where would I start looking to see if someone was in foster care in a different state? Would it be the courts, etc.? So that depends on the jurisdiction. So basically it would depend on what were the laws at the time period this was. Did they have a formal foster care system or did they not? Was there an government organization overseeing it, or was it informal? So there's a lot of varying factors. So what I would recommend, if you know the location of where this person lived, contact the library there. I always recommend that. Contact the library there, and they could tell you what kind of records they have, what might be available. So I couldn't really tell you off the top of my head where this is. As I said, it depends really on the jurisdiction and the time period, what the arrangements were, and who would have any records, if any records exist. All right, and we have someone asking, do you have to belong to the Boston Library to do research? Not necessarily. We have a lot of free resources that you can see here in our research guide and through our website. So anyone can use the free resources. For the databases, though, you do need to live in Massachusetts at least, and you can get an e-card on our website if you live in the state and use our online resources. So that'll let you use anything we have online that's available remotely. And you can if you do live in the area, you can very easily get a library card here. If you have a library card at any public library in Massachusetts, you can register it with us and then use that there. Or anyone who lives in Massachusetts can get a card. You don't have to live in Boston, but if you do live out of state, you are limited to just what is free online. Okay, so Leslie's asking, any thoughts about looking for female doctors in about 1875, how to find schools that would accept women? So for that, you'd have to do a fair amount of historical research. So again, I don't know off the top of my head what schools would be doing that for that time period, but there's been a lot written about the subject. So I'd say look for books or journal articles about that subject. You can get an idea of what was around at that time. And if you happen to know the name of the woman you're looking for, if she did become a doctor, that would have been a big deal back then. So there was probably something about her in the newspaper. So definitely try the newspaper. And if you know, and again, I'm going to reiterate my previous suggestion, if you know where she lived, contact the library there and they could tell you what was around back then. So Gale's asking, is there a fee to research newspapers? Again, so if you have the library card with us, you can just go ahead and use it. We don't charge, but if you live out of state, you won't be able to access these databases, but you can send us a question to ask@bpl.org. And we can, in most cases, if you're just looking for a couple things or something like an obituary or whatever, we can find it and email it to you. Right now, we are not charging for that kind of service. So we are looking into a fee schedule, particularly for out-of-state visitors, but right now we don't. So right now, no, there is no fee. Okay, so Sharon's asking about the list of resources. So everything that I talked about in my presentation is in your handout, which I'm going to, okay, so I'm gonna send you a link to that again. Everything I talked about is in the handout. I will also be sending everyone a PDF copy of my presentation. So the links will be in there as well. So you'll be able to look at those right when we're done. I will be emailing those to you when we're done here. Okay, so we have someone asking, would you suggest tracking women graduates back to the particular college or school? Yes, because chances are, especially if the school is still around, they will have a record of her as a graduate. And if she was an involved alumni, they might have records of her in any alumni organization. if she achieved any prominence or whatever, or donated to the school, they'll have information about her. So definitely, if you know what college she went to, definitely try contacting them if they're still around. And there's also, again, try finding a repository of their records if they don't exist anymore. So yes, I would definitely recommend, if you know that a female ancestor went to a particular school or college, definitely try contacting them. So Terry's asking, I'm trying to determine if one of my female ancestors was Native American. Any suggestions on how to proceed? So I'm going to be a broken record here and send you back here. We have a section here on Native American research. So you can find a lot of resources here and on how to research Native American ancestry. So there's something I will give the caveat. A lot of stories about someone who says they have a Native ancestor, a lot of them turn out to be just family stories. Some of them aren't, but that is something I recommend that you be very careful and mindful of. So that's just something to keep in mind. It may just be a family story, but if it is true, then there's a lot of resources here that you can take a look at. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I will also be sending you a transcript of the chat with the email tonight. Well, everyone will get a chat transcript, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, so someone is asking, what about records for convents? That, again, it depends. So those would be held by the church still. So you'd have to figure out what diocese or archdiocese the convent was located in. And if they have an archive, you need to contact them. So church records are still going to be held by the church. It's very rare for them to end up anywhere else. So that's something you would need to contact the church about, where it was located. So someone else is asking, any special place to go to for Huguenot families who came to New Jersey about 1735? So that I do not know. But again, we do have a section up here. If you go to the French section here, we do have a section on Huguenots. So you can try looking at that. But again, I will say, like I said it a couple times here, if you know what area specifically in New Jersey, like if you know what city or town, contact the library there. They're going to have more information about families who immigrated to that area. All right, let's see. So someone else is asking, spent the last 50 years looking for the last name of the first wife of my Revolutionary War ancestor in New Jersey. He was born 1739 and first child was 1768. Many children, second wife, plenty of records. Did they get divorced back then? So divorce did exist. It was very rare. So it is entirely possible that they got divorced. Again, it was rare, but it did happen. So that's a distinct possibility. The other thing that might have happened, she might have died. That was also really, really common, particularly when people were particularly women died a lot in childbirth. So again, I hate to be a broken record. I said this a lot, but if you know where specifically in New Jersey, if you know what town, contact the library there. They're going to have a better idea of what kind of records are available. So, but again, she could have died, they could have gotten divorced, or those are really your two options. I couldn't tell you for sure whether or not they got divorced. I mean, again, it can be very hard just to find records for women in general. That's why we're doing this presentation today, but particularly for the colonial era, it's incredibly hard to find records in general, particularly for women. So I'm not surprised you're having trouble there, but generally try the local library there. So Randy is saying New Jersey has several genealogical societies. So yes, thank you for reminding me about that, Randy. If there's a genealogical society, wherever you're looking at, try contacting them. There are genealogical societies for all over the country for just focus on a location, focus on a particular type of ancestry. There's associations for French Canadians, for Irish, for Italian. Genealogical societies can be a very, very useful tool. So thank you, Randy, for reminding me of that. So yes, definitely try a genealogical society in the area. Okay, and Penelope is saying, yes, so that's true. Yes, like I said, there's a lot we didn't get to cover because there is so much we can talk about. Passenger lists are another source. So yes, those are just, yeah. So passenger lists are another good resource. But that's something, again, that's something that's really tricky to find. So that's one of those things you have to try pretty much every possible variation of a name you can think of that they have been traveling under. So Randy is also mentioning Genealogical Society of Bergen County, New Jersey for one to remember. Oh, well, thank you very much, Randy. That's great. So that's another suggestion for you. So good luck with that. So let's see. So we've covered everything that was in the queue here. So unless anyone has any more questions, we're going to go ahead and wrap up now. So thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate you've had some wonderful questions here. We had a really good turnout today. So once again, this program was recorded and I'll be sending a link to everyone who is registered. Once the link is ready, it should be on our YouTube channel at some point this week, hopefully, if I can get the AV people to get on it. I will also be sending you a links after this class to the handout, to a PDF copy of my presentation, as well as the chat transcript. So if you missed something in the chat box or anything in the slideshow, don't worry about it because you'll be getting it in a few minutes. I'll be sending that right out to everyone. So, thank you very much. All right, so that's about all I have. If you have any further questions, let me just pull this back up. This is how you can submit questions to us at ask@bpl.org. We are also available by phone, all of our business hours, and we have an online chat Monday through Friday from 11 to 1. So once again, thank you everyone for coming. You've been a great audience, and I hope you have a good night.